Over the last couple years, I have been giving one by an honest try. I set up lots of personal bikes with a one by system, have made multiple videos on how to create a budget mullet. If you still don't know what that means getting mountain bike gear range to work with drop bar shifters. Surprisingly hard to do in 2022. After a bunch of different configurations and multiple months, years, I'm actually ditching one by and going back to two by. In this video, I'm going to tell you why I'm ditching one by, what two by options I'm using, and also some interesting quirks I've learned in the process. Before I get into it, I feel like I have to give you guys some quick background information here. When I got into cycling, it was from a purely transportation utility perspective. My truck died, I started bike commuting, I then started a bike-based business where I would ride up to 40, 50 miles with 100 pounds of camera gear on a bike. From then we started Path Less Pedaled, where we did all sorts of touring, where I carried, I think at its peak, about 150 pounds of gear on a bike, plus myself, bike weight, up and over mountains around the country. Because of this background experience, I have an affinity for low gears. I find them super useful. When one by initially came out, I was really skeptical. First one by bike to enter the stable that I rode was the Salsa Cutthroat, and I believe it came with an 1142 in the rear and a 40 tooth in the front. And for a bike packing bike, that is way over geared. Laughably so. I mean, that's slightly lower gears than you would get with a standard road compact double. To me, it still made sense to go with a double because you just get so much more range. A couple months later, then this concept of a mullet build really took off. So basically, drop bar shifters with a mountain bike rear one by. When it first came out, to get that to natively work with no hacks, you had to do it electronically and spend well over $2,000 just to get mountain bike gears or drop bar shifters. That to me seems absurd, especially when back in the 9-speed days, road and mountain bike components worked flawlessly together, but then bike industry. As you guys know, that led me down a rabbit hole of trying to get this mullet set up with a less expensive and mechanical system. And I tried all the things, hacking the cage with a longer mountain bike style cage. I used things like the JTech ShiftMate, played around with Microshift Advent X, which got pretty close. Of course, the most refined of all system has to be the stuff that Ratio Technology is coming out with. It all worked okay. When we went on the road this winter in California, we were doing some pretty bonkers rides with lots of climbing. So I'm talking like climbing 4,000 feet in the span of like 10 miles, lots of extended double-digit grades on dirt roads, and even with a pretty good mullet setup, the low gears still weren't there. Or I could get the low gears, but I'd be spitting out like a hamster on the flats. I think it was on a particularly steep and rocky ride in Santa Barbara where I just decided then and there, when I got back to Montana, I was going to swap all the bikes out to 2x, and that's what I've done. My primary motivation for going back to 2x isn't so much the granularity between the gears, although that is nice, but to get a sufficiently low gear while still having a decent high gear, if you will. I don't need gear inches in the hundreds, but I would like something where I'm not spinning out on the flats, but also having that low gear for when we do rocky mountainous climbs with stuff on the bike. To get the low gears I wanted in a one by, I'd have to run something like a 32 tooth in the front, which is fine when loaded and doing those climbs, but kind of is a pretty big compromise everywhere else. Don't get me wrong, I get the appeal of one by. It looks really minimal. It is one less shifter and derailleur to worry about. So I totally get it. Trust me, I get it. But for me, it just wasn't doing it. I don't need massively tall gears, but to get the low gears that I wanted, I'd be making a pretty big sacrifice. Just to give you a frame of reference and read off some gear inches, because that's, you know, really fun and exciting. I found for me an 11 to 50 in the rear with a 36 was a pretty good sweet spot for kind of steep unloaded riding. Not as high of a high gear as I would have wanted. I would have wanted something in the low 90s, but that yielded a high gear of 88 gear inches and a low gear of 20, which for the most part was fine, let's say 90% of the time. Put any kind of camping gear On the bike, riding that same terrain, I would want low gear inches in the mid to at least the upper teens. And to achieve that on a 1x, I'd probably have to drop down the front chainring to 32. That gives me a low gear inch of 17 gear inches, but the high becomes 78, which even for me is too spinny on the flat. Contrast that to this double that I put on the Bear Claw and that I also have on the Rivendell. It's a 38-24, so much smaller than the standard 46-30, but it gives me a high gear inch of 92 and a low gear inch of 18. So I get that low gear inch I want when climbing in the steeps with stuff on my bike, with the added benefit of getting a higher high gear so I'm not spinning out on the flats. For me, the benchmark of a high gear is 96 gear inches. Like, I don't need to go beyond 96 gear inches. If you're wondering why 96, that is the gear inch that Eddie Merckx ran when he set his hour record. And if it's good enough for Eddie Merckx, then it's good enough for me. I think in an interview, he said he actually would have preferred to run something lower than 96 gear inches. Anything above that is aspirational gearing. With this 2x setup, I get the gear range I want. I'm not running a ginormous like pizza plate in the back. I think the net weight gain after everything was like 200 grams, which is about a third of a water bottle. Basically not a big deal. On the crust Bambora, I put the Velo Orange 4630, which is actually a surprisingly light crank. It's lighter than the SRAM Apex 1x. That gearing works great for road. I find that 4611 is actually a pretty tall gear for me. But on paved riding, paved climbs where things aren't going into 15, 18% grades with loose terrain, then it works pretty good. What have I learned in the process of adding a second derailleur? First off, a lot of bikes these days assume you're going to be running at 1x, so they no longer have braze-ons or even a cable stop. You might have to get some additional hardware to make a 2x conversion work. On the Bear Claw, there was actually a cable stop here. That made it pretty simple. On the crust, there wasn't a cable stop, so I had to buy a clamp-on one in addition to the derailleur and the clamp for the derailleur. I know some front derailleurs have a built-in cable stop, so if your frame doesn't have it, then you can use the built-in one on the front derailleur, but not all front derailleurs have that. Another thing I learned is that there is a surprising variety of front derailleurs out there. So some are bottom pull, some are top pull. You definitely want to keep that in mind when converting your bike. Both the crust and the Bear Claw are bottom pull for what it's worth. Also in terms of clamping, there's lots of options for a front derailleur. Some, like this older 9-speed Tiagra, actually has a built-in clamp, and that's both good and bad. Basically, that means I can only mount this derailleur to a bike that will fit this clamp size. The Bear Claw here is titanium, so the tubes are a little bit oversized. I couldn't use this front derailleur on this bike. On the Bear Claw, I actually bought a separate clamp that fit the down tube size and got what's known as a braze-on front derailleur. So it's basically a front derailleur without the built-in clamp. It's meant to be attached to a slotted braze-on on the bike, either the frame or with an additional clamp. I think if you want the most versatile derailleur that will work on multiple bikes with multiple size down tubes, definitely look for a braze-on one. Another thing to consider is whether you should get a road or a mountain bike style derailleur. I found that on the Bear Claw, even though it's virtually a mountain bike double by today's standards, that the road bike front derailleur operated with a friction shifter actually works great. Actually brings up my next point. You're probably wondering which shifter you should use for a 2x conversion, because the left shifter is kind of far and few between these days. I would actually recommend just going old school and getting a bar end friction shifter. The way that the gearing works out on my chain rings is that I'm mostly in the big ring about 90% of the time if I'm going on flat or rolling terrain. Once we start climbing or when I'm carrying gear, I just drop it into the lower chain ring. So I'm not constantly going from the big to the small ring. Shifting gears with a friction shifter is just fine. It's reliable, way less fussy to set up. On the crust, I've got a left and a right silver shifter from Rivendell. On the Bear Claw, a lot of people didn't notice this, but I'm actually using two right-handed bar end shifters set to friction. All it's got to do is pull cable. That's the beauty of going with simple and mechanical things. You can make things that weren't necessarily meant to work together still work together. Probably the biggest thing I had to worry about when going to 2x was making sure that there was sufficient clearance so that the chain and the front derailleur wouldn't hit the tire, especially when running big tires. I think this is more problematic if you're riding a gravel bike that's super tucked. so with chainstays in the 420 or smaller. I thought this was going to be a problem on the Bear Claw. I just swapped in the 26" by 2.3 wheel and tire combo just to test fit it. And although it's close, there's still sufficient clearance with this setup. That's where I'm at today. I think I might convert more bikes to 2x and do a couple more videos on the whole 2x conversion thing, especially looking for crank sets that are smaller than 4630. I know 4630 was a big step in terms of getting reasonable chain rings that weren't a 50 to 34. But in practice, I think they're still fairly tall. For me, the ideal crank set would be a 4024, which just doesn't exist unless you spend lots of money with a White Industries crank. So if you're interested in my search for a better sub compact crank set, then let me know in the comments below. I think I'll test 1x bikes as they come in, but on my personal bikes, moving forward, 2x or bust. Of course, that's what I think. Let me know what you guys think. Are you hardcore 1x riders and will never touch a 2x ever again? Or are you that crusty 3x user that wondered why even go 1x in the first place? If you guys like these videos, that's kind of going against the current trend of the bike industry, definitely consider supporting the channel on Patreon or buying some stickers and patches, because there's no way SRAM is going to sponsor us now. As always, everybody, keep the supple side down.